Again, it's good to see everyone this evening. Last Sunday evening, Brother Nate began with us a new series of studies on the book of Hebrews, and as he explained, it's a rather daunting study, but because much of the teaching in Hebrews, I think, can be considered as meat and not milk. But I hope that we'll all do our part to read ahead and to study and to see what we can learn from this challenging book. Nate started us off with an introduction explaining the author, which is unknown, the audience, which is unknown, the genre, which is rather unknown, mainly because we're not sure if this was a letter or a sermon or both. In other words, Nate really didn't tell us anything. But no, seriously, Nate, while some of these details may be obscure, the main purpose, the main point, if you will, of Hebrews is clear. And Nate did an excellent job of bringing that out. The purpose is to remind Christians of the superiority of Christ. And we're going to begin with one of the first points, how Christ is better than the angels. To remind Christians also that the new covenant is superior to the law of Moses, and to encourage them not to return to their former ways. Nate covered the first 3 verses where the author gives a brilliant 7-point description of who Jesus is and why he's worthy of following. So this evening we're going to pick up there with verse 4 and, Lord willing, finish the rest of chapter 1. But let's go ahead and read, and we'll begin with verse 1 and read the entire chapter of Hebrews 1. The writer says, "Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you'? Or again, 'I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son'? And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, 'Let all God's angels worship him.' Of the angels, he says, 'He makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire.' But of the Son, he says, 'Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. And you, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like a robe, you will roll them up. Like a garment, they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will have no end. And to which of the angels has he ever said, 'Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet'? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation?" Now, within that 7-point description of Jesus there in verses 1 through 4, the writer mentioned that God at one time spoke through the Old Testament prophets, but now speaks through Jesus. And even though it's not explicitly stated, that could be considered as the first of up to 15 times that the writer points out how Jesus is better or superior. He's better than the prophets because through him God revealed the full picture of his plan. And now, beginning in verse 4, as we said, the writer proves that Jesus is better than the angels. And he supports this claim with 5 reasons at which we want to take a closer look in our study today. Before we do, though, we might ask, why was it important to show that Jesus is better than angels? What's the big deal about angels? In fact, who are the angels? Well, as most of us probably know, angels are spiritual beings. They are created beings, created by God to serve him. They are certainly great in might and power. Psalm 103 verse 20 refers to angels as God's mighty ones. Their knowledge is vast, though limited. Jesus said concerning the day that he would return that not even the angels of heaven knew. Matthew 24:36. Now, as I said, that shows there is a limit to their knowledge, but I think it also shows Jesus was using a comparison there, not even the angels. And so certainly the angels have a vast amount of knowledge. Angels are overwhelming in number. In Revelation 5 and verse 11, John heard the voice of many angels numbering myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands. Angels have constant access to the divine presence of God. Jesus said in Matthew 18 and 10 that the angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. But I think the number one thing that we need to know about angels is that they are God's holy messengers. In fact, our English word angel comes from the Greek word angelos, which is a transliteration, and we learned what that means this morning, but it's a transliteration of the Hebrew word for messenger. So basically the Greeks who were translating Hebrew into Greek made up a word for messenger in the Greek language, and then we borrowed from that to get our word angel. And so their very name, though, is an expression of their work. Throughout the history of mankind, the Bible records angels appearing to men and women, bringing God's message. And of particular importance to the Jewish people, and remember the audience we believe was Christians, the audience of Hebrews that is, was Christians of former Jewish background. There was a particular importance of angels to the Jewish people because apparently angels assisted with the giving of the law of Moses. In Deuteronomy 33 and verse 2, Moses writes of the Lord's bringing his law accompanied by thousands of angels. In Acts 7 and 53, just before being stoned, Stephen told the Jewish council that they received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it. In Galatians 3 and 19, Paul says that the law was put in place through angels by an intermediary, that being Moses, I believe. And later in Hebrews 2 and verse 2, speaking of the old law, the writer calls it the message declared by angels. And so it's no wonder that the Jewish people held angels as especially sacred. And so to show Christ's superiority over the angels, in turn shows his, as well as his new covenants, his new law, if you will, their superiority over the Old Testament. Today, it's just as important for us to understand why Jesus is better than the angels. In fact, there are some false doctrines which teach that Jesus was himself an angel. And so showing that he is better than the angels helps to dispute these lies. For example, the Jehovah's Witnesses, or at least some of them, believe that Jesus is or was the archangel Michael. They say that Michael was the first being created by Jehovah, and he was used by God to create all other things in the universe. And then later, Michael was born to the Virgin Mary as a human, thus ceasing to be an angel. And then after his resurrection, Jesus resumed his identity as Michael the angel once more. Now, this may be a rather extreme example. Surely most of the world's religions don't believe that Jesus is an angel. And maybe that's the case, but it's more prevalent than we may realize. Many of the modern New Age beliefs don't dismiss Jesus outright, but they do demote him to the status of an angel or spirit guide, as they sometimes refer to him. But the Bible goes out of its way, particularly in our text here, to prove that Jesus not only is not an angel, but in fact that he is far superior to the angels. And so how then does the writer of Hebrews prove this point? How is Jesus better than the angels? Well, his first point in verses 4 and 5 is that Jesus' superiority can be seen in the name that he has been given. Again, verses 4 and 5 say, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? Or again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. The name son, particularly only begotten son, is a title that only Jesus can properly wear. Now, I'll admit that the phrase sons of God is sometimes used to refer to men. That is, those who have been adopted as sons, such as you and I, because of our willingness to obey God's will. That phrase, sons of God, is found at least 6 times in the New Testament, at least in the King James Version. I won't read all of those, but I'll give you one example. 1 John 3 and verse 1, we read, behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God. And so again, as adopted sons and daughters, if you will, that phrase is sometimes used of mankind. Angels also may be called sons of God collectively, particularly in the book of Job. You may remember from the story of Job that it mentions a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. That's found in Job 1 and verse 6, also in Job 2 and verse 1. And I have to admit, I do not completely understand that scene, exactly what was happening there and why Satan was in the presence of God there. But most scholars assume that sons of God there is speaking of angels. Again, in Job 38, God, speaking of the creation, says, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" But as the Hebrew writer points out with two rhetorical questions here in verses 4 and 5, or in verse 5 rather, no angel was ever called individually my son by God. And certainly no angel, no mortal man has ever been called the only begotten son. By the way, the writer quotes here two Old Testament passages. The first is from Psalm 2, verse 7, which is widely considered a messianic psalm, a psalm that depicts the enthronement of the Messiah, the Lord's anointed one. And the second quote is from 2 Samuel 7, verse 14. Now, immediately that referred to David's son, Solomon, but ultimately it could be applied to the Messiah who would receive the throne of David, being also descended from David. In fact, that's why Jesus is often referred to in the New Testament as the Son of David. One question we may have, though, is what does verse 4 of our text mean when it says that Jesus inherited his name? And also in verse 5, what does the word begotten mean there? Well, I do not believe that it means Jesus at some point became the Son. But I do believe that it was an honor that was bestowed on him, and an identity, at least, that was revealed to mankind as a result of his willingness to take on human form and die for us, or perhaps at the time of his resurrection when he ascended and assumed his position beside the Father. In Philippians, the 2nd chapter, verses 9 and 10, it's a beautiful passage there, speaking of Jesus humbling himself and dying on the cross. And it says, "Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth." In Acts 13 and verse 33, Paul declares that God has fulfilled what he promised to the fathers by raising Jesus, and then he quotes this same psalm, Psalm 2 and 7, that's quoted here in Hebrews 1 and verse 4. And in Romans 1 and verse 4, Paul says that Jesus was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead. And so, as we said, either through his birth as a man, his death at Calvary, or his resurrection, or perhaps all three, these events, these acts, if you will, of Jesus serve to pronounce him and to proclaim him as the Son of God. As we said, many great and important things are said of angels. But as great as they are, none have been given this exalted title of the only begotten Son of God. And this not only demonstrates Jesus' superiority to angels, I think it proves that Jesus himself was not an angel. But next, though, in verse 6, we find another reason why Jesus is better than the angels, and that is because he is worthy of worship. Hebrews 1 and verse 6 says, "And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, 'Let all God's angels worship him.'" Now, here in Hebrews 1 and verse 6, the writer says God's angels, or angels of God. But most scholars believe that he's quoting either from Psalm 97 and verse 7, which says, "Worship him, all you gods," little g, or more likely perhaps Deuteronomy 32 verse 43, which says, "Bow down to him, all gods." And this word gods here, again with a lowercase g, is used in the Old Testament of both angels and men, of created beings. The original Hebrew word there is Elohim, which, as Brother Nate has studied with us, is also used of God Jehovah. And when we're not sure of which perhaps type of God, if you will, is being spoken of, we have to let the context determine which God is being spoken of. And so who here is doing the worshiping in these passages? And who is to be worshiped? Well, obviously, as I think the Hebrew writer is trying to point out, God Jehovah does not worship anyone or anything. And God's word forbids our worship of any other man or angel. In fact, that's considered idolatry. In Revelation 19 and verse 10, John fell down at the feet of an angel to worship him. And the angel warned him, "You must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you. Worship God." Paul also condemned the worship of angels in Colossians 1 and verse 18. And so only God Jehovah is to be worshiped. But the point that's being made here is that Jesus, as the firstborn, and by the way, that's a title that's used quite often of Jesus. It refers to his rank and his privilege and his preeminence. But Jesus is worthy of worship. And throughout the New Testament, we see individuals doing just that, worshiping Jesus. You know, it's no small thing for a man to accept the worship of others. In Acts, the 12th chapter, we read of King Herod wearing his purple robes and sitting on his throne and delivering a speech. And the people begin to shout, "The voice of a God and not of a man." And verse 23 there says, "Immediately an angel of the Lord struck him down because he did not give God the glory." God does not take the worship of men lightly. But not only did God accept, he promoted the worship of his Son, Jesus. We read earlier from Philippians 2, which speaks of God exalting Jesus and giving him a name above every name. And again, verse 10 there says, "At the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth." We also mentioned Revelation 5 and verse 11 earlier, where John heard the voice of thousands and thousands of angels. And we're told in verse 12 what they were saying. They shouted, "Worthy is the Lamb." The Lamb there, if you read through Revelation, is obviously Jesus. "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing." Unlike any angel, Jesus is worthy of worship. And that leads us to our next point in verses 7 through 9. The writer shows us how Jesus' superiority is seen in that he is God, enthroned and anointed. Verses 7 through 9 says, "Of the angels," he says, "he makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire. But of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions." These verses here speak to Jesus' official position in contrast to the position of angels. The first quote is from Psalm 104 and verse 4, which shows that angels, or messengers, as we've already pointed out is the translation there, angels are servants of God. Now, certainly they are high and holy beings, but they are created beings. And even though they do holy service, they were created for service, to be servants of both God and man. And their service can be powerful, but it can also be temporary. Just like the forces of nature, such as wind or flames of fire, as the writer mentions here. God uses both angels and nature at his will. But in contrast, the Hebrew writer clearly pronounces the deity of Jesus. In fact, he refers to the Son as God. The author quotes from another messianic psalm here, Psalm 45, verses 6 and 7, which speaks of God being on his throne and reigning over an everlasting kingdom with righteousness. Daniel says of that kingdom that it would never be destroyed, Daniel 2:44. And the angel Gabriel told Mary that her son would reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end, Luke 1 and verse 33. This son, who is God and who is king, has been anointed. In fact, the word Messiah literally means anointed one. And that has reference to God dedicating Jesus to this office. The scepter of uprightness here is figurative, just as a king's scepter symbolizes his authority. Jesus' authority is based on his righteousness, his love of what is right, and his hatred for what is wicked. In short, God, or rather as God, and as King, and as Messiah, Jesus is certainly greater than the angels. But there's more. In verses 10 through 12, the writer goes on to show us that Jesus' superiority is seen in that he is the Lord who is the eternal creator. Again, it says, "And you, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like a robe, you will roll them up. Like a garment, they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will have no end." This time the quote is from Psalm 102, verses 25 through 27. But remember now, the writer is contrasting angels and Jesus. Back in verse 7, he said, of the angels, he says, and he went on to describe them as being created servants. And then in verse 8, he countered that with, but of the Son, he says, and as we saw, he went on to describe Jesus' kingship. Well, verses 10 through 12 are a continuation of what he began in verse 8. In other words, we could read verse 10 as, but of the Son, he says, and you, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth. And notice in most of our English Bibles how that word Lord there is in all capital letters, which denotes it as the highest name for God, Jehovah or Yahweh. This is the name that God used to identify himself to Moses in Exodus chapter 3. But the Hebrew writer here is saying that this psalm equally applies to Jesus. Now, that would be blasphemy unless Jesus truly is God. The quoted psalm goes on to describe God, and as we've seen also Jesus, as the eternal creator. In the beginning, it was he who created the world, as he already stated back in verse 2, which was one of the 7 points that Brother Nate brought out last week. The Apostle John also professed this. In John 1 and verse 3, he said of Jesus, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Paul echoed these truths in Colossians 1 and verse 16. He wrote there, speaking of the preeminence of Christ, for by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. Now don't forget, angels too were created. And now we read that Jesus is the creator of all things. And so if you put 2 and 2 together, Jesus created the angels. And that clearly makes him superior to the angels. Well, this superiority of Christ over angels is illustrated with one last comparison in this chapter. In verses 13 through 14, it shows us how Jesus is seated at God's right hand. Again, it says, and to which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? The psalm that's quoted here is Psalm 110, verse 1. Experts say that this psalm is quoted or is alluded to in the New Testament more than any other psalm. It refers to the messianic reign of Christ that began when Jesus sat down at the right hand of God. Again, this was also one of the 7 points in the description of Christ back in verse 3. It was proclaimed by the Apostle Peter in his climactic ending of his sermon on the day of Pentecost. Acts 2, verses 34 through 36, he said, for David did not ascend into the heavens, But he himself says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. Peter further wrote in 1 Peter 3 and 22 that Jesus Christ has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. Notice there, the angels are subject unto Jesus. Jesus sitting at the right hand of God versus angels who are subject to him. No angel has ever been invited to sit at God's right hand. Instead, as the writer points out in verse 14, angels are sent forth to minister or to serve. And during the earthly life of Jesus, we have many examples of how angels did just that, how they served him. Angels predicted and announced his birth. They warned his parents to flee from Herod. Angels ministered to him after his temptation. They ministered to him in the Garden of Gethsemane. They stood ready at his betrayal and arrest. Remember, Jesus said that he could at any moment call more than 12 legions of angels. The angels announced his resurrection, and angels were present to explain, if you will, his ascension to the disciples. And today, little do we know how angels may still minister and serve not only Jesus, but those of us who seek to follow and to serve Christ. Notice it says there in verse 14, they are ministering spirits to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation. With a very strong and thorough argument, the writer of Hebrews has shown Jesus' superiority to angels. Angels certainly have a special place in God's plan, but Jesus is far better. In other words, not only is he superior to any human competitors, but he's also better than any spiritual or heavenly beings. And that makes it all the more amazing that Jesus, the Son of God, would be willing to humble himself and be made, what the writer says in chapter 2 and verse 2, a little lower, or rather for a little while, lower than the angels. Jesus suffered and sacrificed and humbled himself so that you and I might be saved.